And welcome. Let us just take a few seconds to get everyone on board and in from our waiting room. Do we still have anyone in the waiting room, Bernice, or everyone is here? All right, excellent. Let's begin. So good morning to those of you based here in Asia Pac. Good evening to those of you dialing in from the US. I know we have a number of participants dialing in from North America, and a very early good morning to those of you dialing in from Europe and the Middle East. My name is Frederick Nabig. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. And welcome to this 8th webinar in our series. Today's topic is beyond PR, beyond public relations. We're going to be talking about strategic communications, specifically for medtech founders and startups. It's a topic that we have we've done a webinar over the last done webinars over the last several years that have been more focused on just the public relations component, about how to compile your press release, how to build your social media strategy. Today, we thought we'd go a little bit more strategic and talk about communications in a broader sense and touch on public affairs issues as well. And we have a terrific panel today, and I'm very pleased to have Emma Jenkins-Lee here joining us from Spurwing Communications, Managing Director with that organization. She'll introduce herself in just a moment. And I'm very pleased to have Jasmeet Kaur here, founder and CEO from Kaur Advisory. So great panel, and you'll hear from them in just a moment. Just for those of you who are following us on YouTube and LinkedIn and may not be familiar with MedTech Innovator, in 30 seconds, we are the world's largest accelerator for traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics. We have, by the end of this calendar year, we'll have about 850 alumni. And these are startups across the world that have gone on to raise 10.5 billion in follow-on funding. This particular webinar is tailored to our Asia Pacific cohort. We have surveyed the participating companies at the beginning of the accelerator program. So we are basing many of the questions today on questions raised by our companies. We'll do the first hour live on YouTube, and then we'll go into closed-door Q&A. It's our usual format. For those of you who are online as webinar participants who are cohort companies, as usual, please feel free to queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So with that, let me turn to our panelists, and I'll begin with Emma. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in public relations and comms, your organization, and some of the type of work that you do with startups.
Thank you, Frederick, and good morning, good evening to everyone that's online and joining us today. So as Frederick says, I'm Emma. My background is in healthcare and technology communications, and I've spent actually just over 2 decades now in this field. Most of that time here in Asia, having spent my career in both Hong Kong and Singapore. I currently lead Spurwing Communications and the team here. We are a healthcare communications specialist, focusing on developing communication strategies and programs that really help brands connect with patients, healthcare professionals, and communities in the most meaningful way possible. The types of organizations we work with, of course, startup companies all the way through to big pharma and big medtech, but on the startup end of communications programs, we are working to either launch, help startups launch their products or their services in the market and think about their story and their narratives that they need to build in order to engage multiple stakeholders, beyond media as well.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Jasmeet, you've had a career with multinationals, which is when we first met, and with mid-sized companies. And now you are running your own current advisory firm in public affairs. Tell us a bit about how you got to that point and what excites you working with the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jasmeet. Call me Jazz. My background is rooted in having built reputational capital for some of the most exciting and valuable brands, like you said, Frederick, across MNCs. But I've also worked with high growth startups, government agencies, and peak bodies, companies like Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson. Uber, Fullerton Health, Medicines Australia, Guardant Health, to name a few. So, really, after 2 decades in healthcare and a decade in technology, I have seen a fundamental challenge where founders are absolutely brilliant, very considered, but often lack the strategic communications to scale and make the impact that they want. So, what led me to my advisory work was this kind of passion to help bridge that gap. And what excites me most about the startup ecosystem and to be here with this phenomenal, diverse, dynamic cohort is really the opportunity to empower founders. So if there's and especially female founders, I have a soft spot for. So not just to tell their stories, but also elevate their voices and connect with the right investors and partners to help them accelerate their growth, but also make the impact that they need to make.
Got it. Thank you for that, Jasmine. And before we dive into the details here, I usually ask a macro question, and I'll turn to Emma maybe on this first. What do you see from Spurwing's perspective in terms of broader trends in the communications space across APAC? What's happening? Is it becoming more or less regulated? Are smaller companies realizing the value of strategic communications? Do you see any significant shifts that we should be mindful of?
Yeah. I mean, I think regulations, we keep an eye on China. We don't see too many changes in that area. They continue to be tight for sure. Look, I'm kind of partly smiling when you're asking the question because when we talk about trends in communications, I suspect there might be a little bit of an eye roll, but I'm going to have to say data and AI.
Yeah.
But that's specific to, I think, AI in medtech, we know is accelerating.
Mhm.
And I think communications must address in the stories that we build and the information that we communicate is, how that is embedding itself. What are how are the algorithms validated? How are startups mitigating bias in the process of using AI? How is safety ensured? That has put a lot of focus on transparent communication around
Yeah.
the real world
Yeah.
evidence, the post-market data that we have, and the outcomes will be critical to building the credibility, especially when you talk about, regulatory pathways and they
Right.
can remain uncertain for a lot of startups. So I have to, yeah, I have to hone in on the AI trend for sure. So messaging, when we think about it, it needs to be balanced with optimism about innovation, but with the humility about risks and the limitations that also presents.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and thanks for that, Emma, and Jasmine, you're free to elaborate on this, but I wanted to just to add to that question as well, as we start to talk a little bit more about the strategic narrative here. What do we mean by strategic communications, and why is that important to a medtech founder?
Um, Strategic communications, I think the way to think about PR versus strategic communications is PR is about visibility and strategic communications is about credibility and asset protection. That's how I explain it to my founders. And, we can see that traditional PR often sometimes focuses more on the media announcements and press releases, but strategic communications, how I like to frame it, is proactive, intentional framework for engaging your stakeholders across the ecosystem, from patients, investors, regulators to media. And this is a fundamental part of the business plan. So it's something that should be considered and should be part of the conversation, especially with founders and leaders. And this shift really means recognizing that your narrative is your most valuable asset. It can accelerate market growth. It can accelerate market entry and funding. And there was a report done by EY that talked about how founders spend about 50% of their time fundraising and stakeholder management, but only a quarter of them, 1 in 4, medtech startups have a formal communications plan, which kind of says a lot. So I think founders need to start thinking about their communications plan rather than just from a PR visibility press release perspective.
Makes sense, and we'll talk more specifically about some stakeholder relationships and stakeholder communications here in a moment. Emma, your thoughts on strategic communications? What does that encompass at Spurwing?
Yeah, I mean, I can only concur with what Jasmeet has said. But I mean, I would also say, we're obviously talking about PR, we're talking about strategic communications. I mean, what's the difference? I would just say that the story narrative and this, the strategic narrative that Jazz refers to, that ensures that PR serves a bigger story, that the story is authentic and that it is one that is sustainable. So when PR is grounded in that clear narrative, that's when PR can go beyond the short-term visibility, to shape the perceptions, influence the decisions, and build that trust over time.
Right.
I think PR is also, yes, it's visibility, but it's also imperative to reputation,
Yeah.
We can talk about press releases, but it is a form of communications, and what goes out in that press release must be well thought through. It must be grounded in that broader strategic narrative. And I would say that actually, press releases can be strategic. We're often working, news should be strategic. We're often working with clients, maybe 6 months out, particularly startups, to kind of map what does long-term visibility look like? What does the next 6 months look like? From regulatory filings to clinical study readouts, like mapping out what the news flow is and being intentional about when you put that news out. We see brands put news out on Friday night. It's not a mistake. It's highly intentional and very strategic. So I think, yes, the story narrative, PR has to be grounded in that for it to go beyond the visibility piece.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And obviously, and we'll come back to reputation management in a moment, but tailoring messaging, Emma, just staying with you on this for a second. Do you have some examples of how that might fundamentally differ for a startup that's communicating to let's say a regulatory authority versus an investor, and what should they do to tweak that messaging and the narrative?
Yeah. I mean, actually, I'm going to say consistency is actually key here.
Yeah.
A founder or a company narrative is the same at its core, the problem they're solving, why it matters, why their solution is credible. And of course, that framing shifts with the audience. For an investor, the focus, my recommendation is the focus is, market potential, the scalability, the return. The message should highlight, the size of the unmet need, what your competitive advantage is, the pathway to growth and profitability. On the other hand, a regulator, the emphasis shifts to safety, efficacy, compliance. The same product story is told, but backed by data, clinical validation. So investors want to know, will it make money? And the regulators need the proof that it's safe and effective and compliant. But ultimately the narrative, the why, the what, the when, the who, is at its core constant, but the slight lens changes. But I would just also say, don't fluff the numbers to anybody. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thanks for that, Emma. And Jazz, let's just hone in on the investor piece of this. A question we often get from founders is, how do I best communicate to my existing investors? Many startups here on the call will have a cap table that consists of friends and family, and then you have angel investors, and then you have academic institutions who contributed grants, perhaps, and you then have your institutional investors and larger VCs. and all of them need to be kept up to date about progress and what you're doing and so on. And then, of course, you got your communications to prospective investors, the ones that haven't yet invested, that you're looking to raise money from. How do you distinguish between those two, and what advice would you give companies in terms of talking to those different, very distinct groups of investor stakeholders?
Yeah, so I have to echo Emma's point around keeping your narrative completely consistent. Investors see this. They're a savvy bunch of people. They do want to know if you're going to make money, but investors, 84% of investors say if there's no clear narrative, they're not investing in you. And startups with clear narrative have the potential to raise about 40% more capital. So that is a very powerful tool if you think about it. Keeping your narrative consistent, keeping your messaging consistent, but also tailored to your audiences. So I want to also emphasize your pitch deck is not your narrative. It's not your narrative. It's a visual tool, like a press release is a tool to get your message out there to the right audiences. So again, what Emma said, your why, your why, your why, your why. Think about your why at least 7 times and communicate it throughout your narrative in various forms, and also ending with the so what. So to what end are we doing this? And we're in the medtech space, so it's about patient impact. Talk about your patients, what this means to what your technology is going to enable to address unmet need in this region, in this space. From a principles perspective, I think current investors want to see your consistency and how sustainable you're going to be. Don't reach out when you just want more funding. So the conversations that I'm having with investors, and also between my founders and investors, as part of as a capital connector, is that investors don't want to be used just from a funding perspective. They want to be part of the journey. So educate them. They're actually your stakeholder, and it could be your biggest ambassador across the ecosystem, because these investors also have connections with regulators, payers. So think about them as your ambassador. Keep them updated. Build trust with them, because if you're not keeping them updated on your progress, that kind of disintegrates the trust. And you want to ensure that you have that trust capital, which is vital for future fundraising rounds. Prospective investors, again, Emma talked about data, but turn your data into that story. Just don't talk about the technology. The technology is key, but think about your value-based care outcomes, your efficacy, cost effectiveness, impact. And a tool that really helps, which founders don't often have, is this one pager. Just have a one pager for warm introductions, on-the-spot conversations. And I have seen founders triple their introductions once they have a warm one pager and a crisp narrative. I'm actually advising on a startup at the moment, and I'm helping them strip out their jargon, adding proof points and mapping the stakeholder ecosystem. And it's kind of proving itself, because that is leading to funding and it's leading to some pilots. So this is just, it's kind of a bit of common sense, but hopefully it helps.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And just getting very tactical here, a question that crop up from time to time here is, with my existing investors, how often do I need to communicate with them? Is it enough that I send them a newsletter on progress every quarter? Do I need to bring them together for investor meetings? What are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of best practices, perhaps in terms of how startups can make sure that they keep that engagement with their existing pool of investors?
So I think it depends on your investor. There's some investors like to be across, because it's their money, across what you're doing on a weekly basis. I mean, if that's the case, then you need to know the relationship you have with your investor. Doing a one-page update that you do to some of your employees, include your investor with a high-level update. Bi-monthly, I think, is really, when I say bi-monthly, twice a month, I think is something that investors sometimes think it's not too much, but just enough. Investors just want a monthly kind of update, get together, have that in have an update once a month, and then do an investor meeting with the multiple investors every quarter. So these are some of best practices. So newsletters is interesting for the investor, but I think in addition to the newsletter, you need to also add something maybe bi-monthly, just specifically for your investor on how the money is being spent, where it's going, what you're doing, what that next journey is going to look like.
Good point. Good point. And Emma, just coming back to the narrative and the company story here, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you sometimes see with startups as they craft that, as they start to tell their story, and is there one or two pieces of advice that you could give companies to make sure that has a real impact?
Yeah, I think the thing that we probably see, the most common thing we see, is that many founders dive straight into technical detail. Very close to what they're building or have been building. They go too deep, too quickly, and I think forget some of those basics. And again, I have to continue to echo what the theme of building a strategic narrative that Jazz and I have been talking about. Why does this matter? Who is it for? And what does this problem solve? When and how? It's not, we see people so passionate about what they're building and the technology, and of course, that is at the core. But building the strategic narrative, as Jazz says, is going to also help propel them to success. So I think we see the focus on the technical detail is perhaps one of the most common mistakes. You've got to engage an audience, so if we go technical, you lose them very quickly before you've even built the context around the technology. So I think set the scene first, again, storytell, bring the audience, whether it's the investor or the patient or the regulator, on the journey. Make sure, I think in addition to the technology, you need to make sure you explain why your team is uniquely positioned to deliver. Investors and stakeholders buy into the vision and the people driving it. And I think we often see people so focused on thinking the product is so great, it will speak for itself, but it won't.
Good point. Good point. And just staying with you for a second, Emma, let's move on to maybe media. And we are going to talk about press releases, of course, as well. It's not a topic we're going to dismiss here. When a startup is looking to engage with journalists and media, the question comes up: what is really newsworthy? What makes something worthwhile for a journalist to write about and potentially interview a company? And obviously there are the funding events and there are potential product launches, but in between, if you don't have a funding event, how do you come up with something that's newsworthy enough to get some media coverage?
Yes, all very good questions. Journalists absolutely look for what's new. What news? It's in there as a clue. They look for relevance to their audience. Why does this matter to my reader? And the impact, what's going to be the result of this? And that doesn't have to be what's going to be the result, what's the result of this right now, but, what is going to be the impact and result of this, in the future? A story that shows change, a story that shows solving a problem, a story that challenges conventional thinking is also
Good point.
Always welcome. The Me Too stories, I'm afraid, don't typically get a lot of pickup, and ties to bigger trends, to bigger debates, to things that are happening today in our society. We talk about it. It's less about the press release, but more about why the readers should care about what's in that press release, We do see obviously the press release as a key tool in the early days, which is why we talk about it so much, because it is a great tool to talk about, whether it's the funding or a clinical data readout. It's great for communicating those milestones, and it lives online forever. So, and it helps with kind of search. People can find you. So I don't want to devalue the press release, but it comes back to, what is your strategic narrative? What is your story? And the red thread that carries through every single piece of communications you put out there. Your press releases want to tell a consistent story over time. But outside of that, and again, something we don't see a lot of is that, the consistent kind of PR program. But I would say founders can offer, thought leadership and insight, if they've got data to share, clinician perspectives, or just if they are brave enough to have commentary on wider healthcare issues. These are all opportunities to position founders or CEOs of startups as credible voices that can explain what's happening in the industry and why it matters. So you've got to be prepared to kind of come out of your own kind of, immediate sphere. And over time, I think that helps build relationships with journalists. So when they speak to you, they're not just hearing about what you want to tell them, but you're also offering them some value and insight. So, hopefully, it takes years. It can take years, but journalists kind of want to come back to you for comment. But I would say that, think about what else you can add outside of your own news.
Good point, and thanks for that. And yes, the whole topic of thought leadership is something that's sometimes misunderstood and sometimes not fully, I'd say maybe leveraged or made the best use of. And Jasmine, maybe you can share a little bit about your perspective on thought leadership, what it is, what beyond being maybe interviewed for an article, and what, coming back to the point that you made earlier about being proactive, what can startups do to be proactive about thought leadership and without necessarily costing them an arm and a leg?
Yeah, and I do want to add to what Emma had mentioned
Please.
around, and it falls into thought leadership actually as well quite nicely, is when you're thinking about how you want to communicate and the elements of what you want to communicate, remember the human interest piece, right? So the technology is key, but to what end? I always say this to my leaders and founders, it's, to what end are we doing this? Have that human interest story. Tell a compelling patient story. Talk about a partnership. Have a KOL or a key opinion leader or a doctor or healthcare professional to be part of that story. Reflect your ecosystem partners. That's really key, because founders, and rightly so, they want to keep the story and kind of take control of the story. And sometimes they're telling the story. And a lot of the time, the credibility comes when someone else is telling the story for you, about you. And so thought leadership can be, think about sharing your expertise to build that credibility influence like Emma was talking about. But think about it from transforming a founder from a product seller into an industry authority. And the elements that comes with that is, bringing that human interest piece in, your partners in, that ecosystem impact in. And, some of the thought leadership pieces we are seeing is actually, from a channel perspective, happening a lot on LinkedIn and podcasts. So you can see the move away from traditional media as a channel for creating thought leadership or creating influence, when there is these amazing emerging technologies and individuals that you can reach out to help tell that story with you. So LinkedIn is a key one, and cheap one, it's free.
Yeah.
Post about you, your team, what you're doing. And there was some research that recently I saw that LinkedIn thought leadership is 3 times more influential and effective than ads and press releases.
Interesting.
And that says a lot for us too, for Emma and I, in terms of how media and community channels are changing from a communications perspective. So channels are diverse. LinkedIn is great for regulators, investors, B2B, stakeholders. Industry-specific media is great as well. Clinicians, hospitals, administrators, but this is evidence-based content, especially if you want to reach those, keep evidence-based. Mainstream media, there's a lot of that, but there's also emerging media, technology media, podcasts. That's great for building trust and brand awareness, especially when you have to do it in a compliant way. And I think we're going to talk about what that looks like, what compliance means, because you can talk about your technology, but you can't always talk about your product to D2C. So understanding the compliance and regulations, especially in this part of the world, is highly regulated. So always bring in a thought leader that is external to you from like a HCP to talk about the product, humanize it with a patient, bring in one of your partners to talk about what it means and why they've partnered with you. Yeah, have those elements in.
Great point, and perfect segue to talk about compliance. And sorry, Emma, did
Sorry,
you?
I do want to
Yeah,
add, I think all really, really great points. And it just made me think about, we've always talked about diversity of channels, we kind of get hung up on, where do I want to be? Do I want to be in the Straits Times? Do I want to be in Bloomberg? But you have to think about where your audience is. So we've always talked about diversity of channels, but I would just have to add, the AI lens here is really also continuing to change that. So how people search, as we all know, is changing. And so it's almost somewhat democratizing the value of some of the channels. So, Jazz is talking about podcasts and, maybe more nuanced media, which is actually showing up in citations in your AI search, whereas publications behind paywalls are not. So it doesn't mean that something like an FT or a Bloomberg isn't valuable anymore. That's not what we're saying. But we're just saying you've got to think about, where do I need to be? Where's my audience? How am I showing up in AI search today? And which channels, or what's the most valuable to me? So don't I think disregard a podcast or a more, what sometimes in our industry we classify as a tier 2 publication, because as I say, we're democratizing value now. So be a tier 2 publication. At the end of the day, if you're reaching 1,000 people that you want to reach versus 10,000 who you don't really know how many of those you need to reach, so I would just add that to all of Jazz's great points.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and certainly there are so many smaller podcasts available now. It's relatively easy for a startup to get to know one, and they'd love to have you on board, because they obviously need to make sure that they maintain a regular flow of new interesting speakers and panelists and so on. So podcast is a great way of maybe just getting out there. Then of course there are maybe not directly related to, and typically not classified as thought leadership. Ultimately, a lot of the clinical work that our startups are working on will hopefully at some point lead to a published paper in a peer-reviewed journal. I guess you wouldn't typically classify something in a medical publication as thought leadership, but there might be clever ways of leveraging that in mainstream media that could have an impact, and could be genuinely useful beyond that core clinical community.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Jasmine, please. Yeah.
So just because of what Emma was saying before, kind of sparked some other things. And so when you were just talking about clinical papers and kind of medical institutions, don't disregard them, because leveraging your relationships and building relationships with medical institutions, patient advocacy groups, industry bodies, accelerators like yourself, really can take all of that technical pieces that you have, or that technical technology that you have, that's going to make an impact, and have an ability to actually land it with the right audiences, and also create policy conversations, and make you that thought leader with key policy makers. So I was thinking about an example that I had worked on in my previous company, which is Guardant Health. What we did was we leveraged our relationship with APAC Med. Hopefully everyone knows APAC Med on this call, which is, if they don't, it's the Asia Pacific Medical Devices Association. It's a membership body. Frederick and I go way back because we were part of the OG team that helped build it. So very passionate about them too. But from an APAC Med perspective, what we did when I was at Guardant Health was there was no NGS committee. There are various committees like government affairs, digital health, but there was no NGS committee, next generation sequencing committee. And so all of the companies that were members that was in that space, came together to nominate and talk about having a committee, which we ended up having. And then we co-authored the first NGS white paper together as an industry body, as an industry and all competitors coming together to talk about it. We ran education campaigns with APAC Med. We mapped the reimbursement pathway. We created investor messaging and policy messaging. And the results were amazing. This was just happened about a year ago. It accelerated adoption. It enabled conversations with partners. It showed that there was a whole industry talking about NGS and access for NGS to patients. Because technology, talking about your technology is just not enough. Creating the narratives that connects the dots for your ecosystem partners, from investors, regulators, and partners are key, but also coming together as an industry to talk about it together. I am a big advocate for. So definitely, leverage the institutions and relationships that you have, like accelerators and industry bodies.
Thanks for that. Yeah, great point. And very often when you're a startup, you may not necessarily leverage that network of trade associations as maybe as well as you could. Certainly for a regional one, APAC Med is good, but there are a number of smaller national trade bodies and trade associations as well. There's in Australia, you've got MTAA and the BioMelbourne Network, and you've got KMDIA in Korea and others across the region. And they're very keen to work with member companies to do white papers and position papers and work on public policy matters. So that's a good advice. Jazz, I wanted just to pick up on something we spoke about briefly earlier, and that's compliance. And maybe some regional differences, just for the understanding of everyone here on the call. There are some rules and regulations of what you can and cannot do, and there are some quite significant differences between different parts of the region. Can you maybe just enlighten us on that briefly?
Yeah, I know this is a very critical consideration for all companies in the pharma, medtech, healthcare space, not just for founders, but anyone in this space, especially looking to scale or navigate APAC. It's very different from the US. Many countries from Singapore, India, Australia, Japan, I can rattle even more, have highly restricted, prohibited DTP, which is direct-to-patient advertising, for all of, whether it's medical devices and diagnostics or pharmaceuticals. So it's not to say that founders can't navigate this. I think, of course, they can, but it's how you do it. Talk about it from a therapeutic area perspective, talk about the disease state. Don't advertise your specific product. You're not allowed to do that. That actually leads to regulatory breaches in this part of the world. And if you want to talk about therapeutic options or device options in this space that in this therapeutic area that you have an impact in, bring in a qualified professional, have a KOL talk about it, because the KOL can, and they have to be a registered healthcare professional. Or if you have a medical affairs person internally that can talk about it, they also have to be a registered medical affairs person. Because often what I see is there's medical affairs folks, but they're not registered. And only doctors and medical professionals can talk about treatment options, because that is where the advice comes from. And that's where these governments, agency, and regulatory bodies see the credibility. So always remember, if you're going to be talking about treatment options, make sure that you're doing it in a publication that is specific to a medical publication, because you can only talk about treatment options in medical publications. But if you want to talk to consumers think about talking about it from a disease awareness state, and also bring in patients, like I said before, humanize the story, bring in patients, because they're the ones that are going to make that impact emotionally. We all get impacted by patient stories. I think it's one of your biggest tools in your comms arsenal, to be honest. And yeah, leveraging medical institutions and industry bodies, like I said before. So think about
Very good. Yeah.
from a stakeholder mindset perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. Emma, question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Emma, did I miss anything? Is there anything?
No, you've got got everything. I was just, lead with education. Yeah, third party. I mean, these are all the elements. All the elements Jazz highlighted are all the elements of the programs that we put together for our clients in a highly regulated space. I would just say, you have to think, this is why you have to think outside news.
Yeah.
Because the media, you were fundamentally not allowed to mention your brand name, your product name, in almost all of the markets, Frederick, actually.
Yeah.
So you have to widen, you have to widen that. Although I would say I would definitely also consider what you put out on LinkedIn, because it's, even though it's your own channel, as a regulated company, you still might be breaching. So you have to be also very mindful of what you talk about on LinkedIn as well. But these are all those elements are the way forward to communicate for MedTech and pharma.
And
great point.
I want to just add that you don't have to do this alone. Emma and I are here to help. So just reach out to us.
Great point. We'll share your contacts with our cohort in a moment. No, it's a great point. A workaround, I guess, is what you were saying, Jazz, that if you do have a KOL, or if you do have a medical director or someone on your scientific advisory board that's prepared to put their name under an article, and then assuming that they're a registered clinician, then that would be a way to talk specifically about your product, brand, and solution. Great. A question that crop up from time to time, and I'll pose it to both of you, and either you're welcome to comment on this, is this concept of staying in stealth mode. And we come across, typically companies that are part of MedTech Innovator, by definition, they're not in stealth mode. They've gone beyond that. But fairly frequently, we come across companies that are very secretive about what they do. They want to stay in stealth. And I get the question sometimes, is there a risk of staying in stealth mode for too long? And if I'm a startup in stealth mode, what's that one milestone that would make me want to go public?
Do you want me to say that, Jazz?
Either of you.
Go first, and then I'll go.
Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I think it's a tricky one. You definitely obviously you can't stay in stealth mode forever. I get that. You might you're mindful of competitors, what they know, what they don't know. But ultimately, if you don't tell your story, someone else is going to go first, and you will be left behind. It's that simple. But then on the other hand, you can't go too early. I think this is quite rudimentary.
You need to have your IP portfolio in order, I guess.
You have to have something tangible to show. At a minimum, you should have a prototype. If it's a product, be ready to answer the questions. When do you hope to file for regulatory approval? When are you going to launch? And look, even if it's a couple of years off, that's okay to say, but giving a clear sense of timing matters. So if you wait until everything is ready and perfect, it will never be the case. So people just want to know, when will I be able to get my hands on it? But understand that pathway to regulatory approval and launch, it takes some time. But it's a fine balance. But Jazz, I don't know anything to add.
Yeah, no, just on your point around it is a tricky question. It's a tricky in terms of timing, but I think that having worked with founders now since 2017, I feel like a lot of them want to stay in stealth mode, and they do for a bit too long, because I think there's this fear of being copied or making a mistake, or, if it's a new kind of technology, they don't want to go out there and prepare the ecosystem and the landscape for their competitors to come in, or going too early because they're new. I, I'm a big believer that early visibility and credibility, it has to be credible, so you have to have an MVP of sorts, and some sort of timing and timeline, reduces frictions with regulators and investors. So there was a study that was done that said that if you going and having early engagement with regulators actually reduces the approval times by 25%. That is huge for an organization, let alone a startup. So I would advise, echoing what Emma said, for startups to come out of stealth mode when there's a milestone that demonstrates that external validation and has a material impact to the business. And this could be like a regulatory designation, clinical trial approval. Initial seed funding is always a great story from a reputable investor. But then that partnership that comes with it. So try to add, some sort of content to your press release or the communications you want to get out there. Clinical milestones, impact to your patient cohort is always a lovely story. People want to know about the impact you're making to patients. So, these kind of points when you're coming out signals to the market you have external validation. That builds critical momentum. And like Emma said, if you're not actively telling your story, someone else is dangerously.
Good point. Before we go into reputational management, which is something I want to touch on before we close, quick question to Emma. How do we measure the success or the possible success of a public relations and a communications initiative? What are the metrics that typically you encourage smaller companies to look at beyond just maybe number of likes on social media? What else is there?
Yeah. First one is, metrics like impressions, clicks or likes, they have their place.
They do.
But I would say that, yeah, the real test is whether communications create tangible outcomes. And I think sometimes where the gap here is in terms of PR being able to measure tangible outcomes is that it is often a partnership between the agency and the client. Because when we talk about tangible outcomes, we could be talking about, are you getting inbound inquiries from, say, an investor or partner or clinician? Has someone called and said, I saw that article, which does happen. Of course, it's not happening in its hundreds, but it does happen. So that relies on kind of the feedback from the client side to say, oh, hey guys, and actually I have to say it just happened to us this week, actually, with a medtech company. We launched a large piece of research on behalf of the client, with the client. And the client just fed back that the head of a market just took a call from a CEO of a hospital to say, can we talk? And can we also cite and reference your study in the hospital?
Nice.
That is fundamentally the power of great PR done well. Storytelling, using data. And so that is a tangible outcome. But again, we as an agency wouldn't necessarily know those calls are coming in unless kind of we close the loop with the client. So, when people talk about vanity metrics, these are the things that, the impressions that the PR agencies, have tools in order to measure. But that feedback, the sales guy saying, yeah, he took a call because someone had seen something. Yes. And I'm sure it's happening. It just doesn't, I'm not sure there's a solid enough feedback loop. But I would also just kind of flip it a little bit and say, how are companies using PR as well to open doors, how, are you using kind of, that awareness in media or that engagement, those comments and engagement in your, your fundraising decks or, whatever it may be, because they are things to show that your story is getting some momentum and that, and show that credibility. So I think that there are a few things, I think journalists coming, again, takes time to build, but journalists coming back to you for comment and input and That's another metric that we use. So lots of things outside of those impressions and click type metrics. But ultimately, we would love to be able to report that strong communications translates into action, more meetings, more credibility, and more opportunities opening up. And that's when we see the needle moving.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thanks. Quick reminder to our cohort just to queue up your questions. We'll get to those in about 10 minutes. So I think we have some of them in the chat. Use the QR function at the bottom of your screen as well, and we'll get to your questions in just a moment. So let's talk a bit about crisis and reputational management. And Jasmine, I'll turn to you here first. Maybe you can just set the context. What is reputation management? It's sometimes referred to as crisis insurance policy. What does that mean? What are some of the what if scenarios that a medtech founder should sort of have in their bag and be ready for when the shit hits the fan, as they say?
Yes. And I think oftentimes comms is only brought in when shit hits the fan. You should really be part of your business plan. Crisis is a component of it. So building a strong reputation is what your comms, we talked about comms as a strong communications infrastructure in the beginning of this conversation. This is what that looks like, building that strong foundation and then because that strong foundations builds your reputation. So when a crisis does hit, not when, you have a strong reputation that acts like a crisis insurance. And that gives you some grace, buys you some time and credibility. And these are things money cannot buy or replace quickly when you have a crisis, because a strong reputation means when you get some grace, you have the ability to actually have a concerted conversation with the key stakeholders that are impacted by this. What if scenarios, just to think about some examples, could be like a product recall or a safety issue, like a device malfunction. AI washing is a thing at the moment, as much as we talk about AIs kind of impacting the entire industry, which it is. Think about how you're talking about AI, because AI washing is a thing that regulators and people find is something that could really impact your reputation from a business perspective. So when you're talking about AI, be considerate about how you're talking about AI. Adverse events is another one. Data breaches, patient privacy issues. We've seen a few of those coming out. Misstatements over claims that can lead to not just a crisis from a reputational perspective. From a reputational perspective, it can really impact the license to operate for your company from a regulatory and a legal perspective. So make sure when you're marketing your product, you're really thinking about making ethical claims, not overstating your claims. Never fudge your numbers, like Emma said before. Negative news about a partner, so your reputation can really be tarnished by that supply chain vendor, the collaborators that you have built relationships with or are building relationships with. And I think we've seen a lot of this recently: leadership and executive issues, so personal scandals, misconduct, those kind of behavioral issues by senior leaders. And most timely at this point is geopolitical and misinformation crisis. Shifting narratives outside your control. So most timely one was this President Trump's recent claim that linking paracetamol use to pregnancy and autism, which is a false claim. But I want to just highlight to the people on the call, know how pharma companies producing paracetamol products or have paracetamol in their pharma products are letting the doctors and medical institution and regulators debunk the information first before issuing their statement. So that third-party piece on making sure you've got that credible ecosystem, let them go first, and then plan your comms with me and Emma together.
Makes sense. And Emma, your thoughts on crisis management and some of the examples here that Jazz listed. What should be the first step a startup should take when something like this happens? God forbid, a patient death, an adverse event, or something, or some of the other examples that Jazz listed. And then maybe some examples where you've had to step in and assist your clients on on crisis management, if there's anything that you can share.
Well, I'd say the first step in any crisis is to know the facts.
Yeah.
Without clarity, you risk making statements that I guess you'll later have to correct. So know your facts. Take the time to know your facts. I think it's not about an instant reaction. It maybe not be about a reaction at all. And then from there, identify 100% the credible voices who can support and reinforce your message. And I think that kind of goes back to Jazz's earlier point about, the network and using the associations and people, and building those relationships in this time that you can kind of draw on are really, really, really important. So I think they, for sure, I have to say, will carry more weight than the company speaking alone. I guess the so what, just because you say kind of attitude comes out. So those credible voices, and the more you can build them as part of your strategic communications to talk on your behalf, is really, really important. Look, I don't have any specific crises. I mean, thankfully, we tend to avoid them. Some of them are obviously common, but I know it's not MedTech specific, but Tylenol this week is just such a prime example of, and just so well managed on their part. Of course, their crises case study from way back when goes all the way back. It's still one that's brought up, and I think the way in which they've responded to this one this week will also kind of go down in the history books. If you go on Tylenol's website, there's a pop-up now that addresses it.
Interesting.
And they have solely lent into scientific evidence.
Well, they saw this coming, didn't they? It was something that was raised already a couple of months ago by the administration. But yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah, and it's just very smart. It's very smart, and sometimes there is this, particularly if it's your company. I think at the founder level, you're kind of very protective of your company. You want to defend anything that's said or done, but I think you have to, kind of step out of that and be rational about, as much as you want to say something, it's maybe not appropriate, and it's not, and sometimes it's really best to say nothing at all. And of course, working with Jazz and I, we will tell you when that is the case.
Right.
But yeah, I think Jazz,
that's not always an easy thing to determine.
And you have to see how quickly things escalate. You assess something. Is it going to die down in a couple of days? Is it something that is going to go away? All these questions that you have to ask. There are some predictive tools out there in the market that predict whether the news and the news cycle is going to continue, which is interesting technology. But yeah, I think Jazz made some great points about that credible voice.
And just add to a story,
of course, Jazz, go ahead.
Is you don't need a 200-page plan. Focus on the essentials. Know your vulnerabilities as a company in the area that you're in. Identify just top 3 scenarios, assign a clear chain of command, know who's going to speak. Make sure it's the founder who's speaking, or the medical affairs person who's speaking, and then your public affairs person or comms person, because these are individuals that are well-known spokespeople. And if don't have a marketing salesperson be your spokesperson.
Good advice. Yeah.
Not going to help with the credibility of your organization, but also if you're outside of being a founder and part of a big organization like Tylenol, you'll not see any of those people speak because it will impact stock price. So those are the, think about also your statements, who's approving your statements. I always think about everyone's a steward of reputation in your organization, but that you have champions of reputation, which is your public affairs person, your compliance person, your legal person, your medical affairs person. These are people who are going to help you shape those messaging that can be said legally, and have those prepared holding statements for these issues, because having at least some sort of plan can really help a day in when there's a crisis that hits. So
I've run a small company. I may not have any of those individuals in my team, can I bring an agency in to speak on my behalf to journalists?
Absolutely.
Is that still going to maintain my credibility as a startup?
Well, I think a lot of the time the founder should, but Emma and I are well versed in helping train leaders with our experience. So we can help you put together the plan, the messaging, have internal people review the messaging, especially from a legal perspective. That's incredibly key.
Sounds good. Sounds good. We are up. It's the top of the hour, so thank you both so much for being part of this. Final question to each of you, and it's really about any final tips or advice based on what we've spoken about. Final parting words with our audience this morning, and maybe Emma, I'll turn to you first.
Cool. As a communicator, I'm going to say don't leave it too late to communicate. I think we talked about earlier, stealth mode, when to communicate, what to communicate. I think too many founders do stay quiet.
Yeah.
I think, don't be too humble and think, oh, well, that's not news, that's not a story. We see that a fair bit. So I think silence, I mean, Jazz will be able to talk a little bit more about the investor lens, but I think silence can make investors and partners nervous as well. So I think it's imperative to keep the market warm. I think they want to see steady signals of progress and momentum. One meeting, one press release, one LinkedIn post alone isn't going to secure trust or investment. So I think it's about keep the market warm with consistent and thoughtful, meaningful updates.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo a lot of what Emma also said and just add on that the medtech market is booming, it's crowded, but remember your comms is your differentiator. So start early, be intentional, stay visible, to summarize what Emma said, but also remember your reputation is your currency.
Very good. Great advice. And on that note, we'll thank our YouTube and LinkedIn live streaming audience, and encourage you to come back next week when I believe we'll talk about talent